Okay, we're on.
All right. Well, good morning and welcome back. Gavin and I are here to discuss the next assigned reading for PSY 3040, Animal Behavior. And we're now going to be into, let's see, let me look at the syllabus. We've got chapters 3 through 5 this week. So Gavin and I will chat for a little bit about chapters 3 through 5. And as is typical, our goal here is to sort of pull out what we see as the most important issues, the most sort of the big picture themes and ideas that if you get nothing else from this particular set of chapters, you get these themes and ideas. And we also do our best to try to anticipate where you all might have, where you might stumble or get hung up, or where you might sections we think might be especially interesting. So we don't typically have a set agenda going into these chats. We read it right along with you guys, and then talk about where we think, talk about issues that we think might be worth your time listening to. So again, just to sort of very briefly, remind you where we are. So we are into the second of several sections, or several, we've broken Wrangham down into sections, I suppose. Last week we covered the preface, introduction, and chapters 1 through 2. This week we'll cover chapters 3 through 5. And then over the next 4 weeks, we will work our way through Wrangham and work our way through the arguments that he presents, and wrap things up on the week of, we aren't meeting the week of Thanksgiving, of course. The final week we will discuss, that's the week of November 30th through December 4th. That's where we tackle chapters 12 through 13. And Wrangham's very interesting afterword, where he makes the case that he's not advocating for the death sentence, which might sound strange at the moment, but you will see that I believe he felt his hand was forced to make a statement regarding his ethical stance on the death sentence, that is capital punishment. Okay, we will distribute the take-home exam, just to remind you, in a little over a month on December 4th, and that will be due by December 11th at 12:50. We will talk much more about the final exam as that date nears. All right, so Gavin, you mentioned that there were a couple of questions or issues that came up in the discussion questions and a posting of the responses to discussion questions, and perhaps the reaction papers. So maybe take just a moment to sort of highlight those.
Yeah, so the one major thing that I saw come up, not continuously, but at least a few times in the reaction paper or the discussion questions, that I thought was worth talking about was that people had sort of some trouble with domestic violence and how that ties into human aggression, and how humans can, be so low in reactive aggression as Wrangham suggests, but also commit domestic violence against one another, or specifically against their intimate partners. And one thing I wanted to mention is that domestic violence, in a sense, is also present in chimpanzees. Males do often beat up on females as sort of a tactic to get them to, or to keep them from hanging out with other males, from having sex with other male chimpanzees, or to punish them for doing that. So, Todd, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, so it's this is an interesting issue, and it is something that Wrangham addressed to some extent. One of the points that he makes is that I think it's partly, sort of anticipating reactions, and maybe these are some of the reactions that you're referring to, Gavin. People, readers are sort of working their way through the first few chapters here, and they're thinking, especially in this one chapter where he talks about domestic violence, He certainly is not arguing that humans do not engage in domestic violence. Specifically, let's just focus in on men's violence against their intimate partners. So, male violence against females, men's violence against women, which certainly is much more than rare. I mean, it occurs, depending on the sample, something around 30 to 50% of women report experience at some point in their lives with domestic violence. Now, that doesn't sound like a very low rate of domestic violence. It doesn't sound like a very low, it doesn't seem to reflect low reactive aggression. I mean, there's a couple of points here. One is, although we can all recognize that domestic violence occurs far more frequently than anyone would wish, rates of 30 to 50% are to be compared with rates of, about 100% in chimpanzees, and something on the order of 80 to 90% among bonobos. Remember, it's all relative. So when we're thinking about humans, the rates of interpersonal violence, particularly violence with in-group members, and especially we'll just talk about violence against females by males. In humans, relative to chimpanzees, it's much, much, much lower. I mean, any way you want to cut the numbers. Chimpanzee males are extraordinarily violent against chimpanzee females. And all of the evidence today indicates that it is in part intended to communicate to the female that she will have sex with that male, and only with that male, or primarily with that male. And in fact, the data indicate that males that are physically abusive to females are in fact the males that are most likely to have sex with her, and in fact are most likely to be the males that sire the offspring that she produces. So in a very tragic sense, this domestic violence works in the sense that we don't know precisely what's going on in the mind of the chimpanzee female, but we can imagine that she's scared to death, and rather than withstand additional beatings from the male, she'll acquiesce to copulations with him over other males. Now, I should note that there is recent work documenting precisely the same effect in humans, that men who are most likely to be domestically violent against their partners also report more frequently having sex with them. Now, we don't know the causal direction. I simply note that there is a parallel relationship in humans. This is work that I published with one of my former graduate students, Nicole Barbero. She was actually the lead author on this, and it's a paper that came out in 2019, I think, maybe last year, in a journal called the Journal of Comparative Psychology. All of this is, all of which is to say, domestic violence is not infrequent in humans. There's no doubt about it, but it's relatively infrequent compared to its occurrence in chimpanzees and indeed in bonobos. I just want to throw out there that it's not clear to me that we want to think about male violence against females, whether we're talking about humans or chimpanzees. It's not clear that we want to call that reactive aggression. I might make a case that could be framed as proactive aggression in the sense that it's aggression that has, a downstream goal has a downstream goal that is more than just lashing out, or more than just reacting to an insult or a perceived wrong. And this is debatable, but I just thought it was worth thinking about, given that we know something about some of the downstream consequences of male violence against men's violence against women, or male violence against females. Does that ring potentially true?
Yeah, I think I think it's at least worth thinking about. I'm not sure that I'm 100% sold that it's
Sure.
not at least partially reactive, but I
Yes.
see where you're coming from.
I think that's true. I think this may be one of those areas where there's a lot more slippage from reactive aggression to proactive aggression. Certainly, if you just think about what's going on in the moment, much male violence against females can be framed as reactive. I mean, if you look at what men report in terms of why did you hit your partner, what they will say is, she didn't have dinner there on time, or she didn't respond when I texted her. And that has a very reactive feel. But what I'm suggesting is that there may be a sense in which, framed in a broader context, in a broader context of the relationship and male sexual jealousy and male attempts to monopolize female sexual behavior, it could be part of a broader proactive aggressive strategy. But we don't have to resolve that right here. I just thought I would point that out. It's a very interesting area of work where there's far more questions than there are answers.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, great question, great comments, and I think students should, if students were wondering about how this all fits together with regard to domestic violence in humans as opposed to chimpanzees, and how to think about this as reactive or proactive, I think if you are one of those students, one of those readers who was wondering how to make all these puzzle pieces fit, well, then you're in good company, because a lot of people are wondering how to make all these puzzle pieces fit, including Wrangham. So it's a good demonstration of things not always being, cut and dry, being one category or another category. And as I mentioned, I can literally research going on right now and being published as recently as a few months ago or last year in 2019. May actually be 2020. I can't recall now. Any other comments or questions that you wanted to address, Gavin?
No, that's it.
Okay, so we'll talk for a little bit here, and so we're going to cover 3 chapters today. The first one he titles Human Domestication. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 Wrangham titles Breeding Peace, and then chapter 5, the title is Wild Domesticates. Now, let's just do our best to move through each chapter. So, human domestication, chapter 3. The basic argument that Wrangham is making in this chapter is that humans are a domesticated species. That Homo sapiens, that modern humans are a domesticated species. Okay? And he makes this case in part by identifying the various dimensions along which humans display the features, the physical features, the psychological features that are more typical or that are typical of domesticated species when compared to their wild ancestral types. So he begins with sort of this. He's reporting on an animal behavior researcher called Raymond Coppinger, who does work with dogs, and Coppinger's interaction with another animal behavior researcher who does work with wolves. And this researcher is called Eric Klinghammer. And Klinghammer tells, he's introducing Coppinger to his tame wolves. These are not, by definition, wolves are not domesticated. They are wild animals. Now, they can be tamed, or they can be relatively tame, okay, as in the wolves that are being, basically raised from birth by humans, okay? And but what Wrangham's doing here is drawing a distinction between domesticated in the sense that he's talking about and wild. So Klinghammer tells Coppinger, hey, come check out these wolves. Come right in the pen. You can pet them and you say hello to them. And Coppinger says, okay. So he walks in and he pats one of the wolves, and the wolf basically freaks out. And goes for him, and tries to bite him. And Klinghammer is saying, get out of here, they'll kill you. And Coppinger's thinking, what is going on here? These are not just like dogs. These are, they're not behaving like dogs. Dogs, in contrast to wolves, are domesticated. And one of the key features of domestication is very low reactive aggression or high social tolerance. Wolves, in contrast, are not low in reactive aggression. They're very high in reactive aggression and very low in social tolerance, and you can't treat them like dogs. Even tame wolves that have been raised as pups, from birth by humans. And that is made very clear here in this particular example. Even the tamest of wolves can very quickly, okay, display their non-domesticated psychology.
Right. So, and I think part of what he's doing in this chapter is making clear the distinction between a tame wild animal and a domesticated animal. And the key difference, as I'm sure we'll get into, is that domestication cannot be, it's not a learned behavior, it's not trained.
Correct.
It is a bred behavior, or it is a oftentimes selectively bred, but sometimes it occurs naturally in what comes to be a different species or a different subset of an animal.
Yes, it's domestication in the sense that we're talking about. Uh, that's precisely it. It's not something that an individual animal acquires in a lifetime. It's something that is typical of every individual animal of a particular species. It's part of the nature of that species, domestication. Now, Wrangham is certainly not the first to make the argument that humans are a domesticated species. In fact, there's a very rich history of discussions of as a domesticated species, modern humans, that is, Homo sapiens sapiens. And he takes us through some of that history, dating back to Blumenbach, who is often referred to as the sort of father of anthropology. But Blumenbach wrote in as early as 1795, and he actually quotes him on page 51. He says, this is Blumenbach speaking, he says, man, and this is from 1795, man is far more domesticated and far more advanced from his first beginnings than any other animal. So Blumenbach was thinking about, species that were known at the time, and basically was making the case that humans are the quintessential domesticated species. And his argument turned very much on our very low reactive aggression, the extent to which we put up with one another in ways that non-domesticated species simply do not. Okay, so, and it's a matter of comparison. Probably the most straightforward comparison is how dogs behave with one another compared to how wolves behave with one another. I presume you know, and as you know, if you've read, that all dogs descend from wolves. Wolves are the ancestral species, and dogs are, in short, domesticated wolves. Now, okay, so he does. So Wrangham takes us through this history of thinking about humans as domesticated species, including some of the darker, more racist history that suggests that only some races of humans are domesticated. Others are less domesticated, and of course, you will be surprised to know, as Wrangham presents, that it was typically white Europeans who were making these, or Europeans, not Americans, but Europeans, who were making these arguments, and typically they were identifying Africans, South Americans, people who weren't European as those who were of the wild type. These were the undomesticated versions of the human species. Now that's since been, clearly, thrown out as sort of part of the prejudiced or the prejudices of the day. But there were others. There were others, including there were others who could see past that, including others working in the 1800s who argued, no. I mean, we're all part of the same species. So I don't want to give the impression that our history, the history of thinking like this, is exclusively, a sort of racist history. That's not the case. But certainly, you can find many people making those kinds of arguments. So he talks about Darwin at one point. Oh yeah, he says. So this is on page 54. Let's see. Darwin himself wrote about humans as potentially domesticated. I'm looking at page 54 and 55. On page 55, Wrangham's writing, he says, by analogy to the farmyard, he, that is Darwin, insisted that the evolution of a more domesticated kind of human must depend on someone's doing the selecting. He could not see how that could have happened. So while Darwin recognized that humans did appear to have many of the features of a domesticated animal, a domesticated species, the low reactivity, low reactive aggression, high social tolerance, Darwin was flummoxed by his insistence that there must have been a domesticator. And given that that would entail, presumably, invoking God, which he did not want to do. The whole point of natural selection was to account for complex design without invoking supernatural agency, which would open up a whole new can of worms. And so Darwin basically said, well, I can't see how modern humans could have been domesticated because there was no one there to domesticate them, and therefore humans can't be domesticated. And so, this was sort of a rare instance of Darwin's inability to see past his hand in front of his face, because the data were all there in front of him, and he was well aware that humans display this extraordinarily low reactive aggression, extraordinarily high social tolerance. So he was struggling with it, thinking about it, but couldn't get over that wall. Did you find that interesting?
Oh yeah. It just continues to amaze me how Darwin, how in how many places Darwin was able to sort of predict things so far back. But you're right. Unfortunately, I guess maybe he didn't have enough foresight to predict how it could have happened, and I think that was sort of Blumenbach's issue as well.
It was.
Having a difficulty in imagining how humans could be domesticated, and that's, I think, where Wrangham's contribution comes in heavily, is his proposed mechanism for how humans may have domesticated themselves, but we'll get into that later in the book, I think.
Yeah, given that Darwin was so prescient about a whole range of later evolutionary thought and of later sort of discoveries and ideas. He was on the right track. He was recognizing that humans appear to be domesticated, but it was this stumbling block of, well, nobody was there to domesticate them. Like, he couldn't get past that. And I will point out that so Darwin also, to his discredit, I suppose, it's hard to sort of unweave, the historical context from, Darwin's ability to think clearly. But Darwin sort of loosely made arguments that some groups of humans maybe were a little more domesticated than others. He didn't go so far as to say some groups of humans were different species, which many during his day did. He said, no, they're all the same species. They're just more or less domesticated. So Darwin was, sort of on the right track in some ways and kind of blinkered in his thinking in other ways. Let's see. So as Wrangham writes on page 58, he says, on page 58, beginning of the new paragraph towards the middle third of the page there, he says, for Darwin, the notion that some populations of humans were more domesticated than others seems to have been an intellectual analysis with no political implications. He was a committed, this is Wrangham's take on things. He, that is Darwin, was a committed abolitionist, who wrote of his abomination of slavery and in general of his admiration of non-white peoples. Calamitously, however, says Wrangham, when the idea of human domestication reappeared in the early 20th century, it was not Blumenbach's universal version that became the focus. Instead, it was Darwin's and Aristotle's theory that different populations were domesticated to different extents. Human domestication came to be seen not only as a cause of racial differences, but also as an index of human value. So we careened off onto a terrible political and social path, which is doubly unfortunate because there were people during that time who were clearly on the correct path, correct in terms of what we know today. That is what Wrangham refers to as Blumenbach's universal perspective. In other words, that all humans in existence were part of the same species and differed as a function of their cultural background, the ecological circumstances, and so forth. So at any rate, all of this is part of a bigger picture. The bigger picture is the argument that Wrangham is making that humans are a domesticated species, and he's attempting to give credit or, discredit, I suppose, to previous discussions of human domestication. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if, because another point in Wrangham's favor is that he has, I think, more anthropological evidence and just, I guess you'd just call it anatomy in terms of the physical characteristics of the domestication syndrome that humans display that I don't know if Darwin and Blumenbach had with the, smaller canines, smaller like skull and brain case.
Right. Well, I mean, anthropology has made anthropology and biological anthropology and evolutionary biology, particularly with respect to humans, and archaeology. I mean, all of these fields have, blossomed, have exploded really since, Blumenbach and Darwin. And so, yeah, I mean, the fields, insofar as we're talking about the available data, is much richer today than it was in Darwin's day and than it was certainly in Blumenbach's day. Bottom line, it is now widely recognized that humans are, or that humans have all of the features of a domesticated species. Okay, and so as Wrangham summarizes on page 60, he says, human self-domestication. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So if humans are a domesticated species, and if there was no domesticator, okay, well then we're left concluding that humans must have self-domesticated, must have domesticated themselves, not on purpose, but that's not necessarily the case. It's not, you don't have to argue that it's been done on purpose. It could have just been incidental to what else was going on ecologically and evolutionarily. Human self-domestication, as Wrangham says on page 60, in some form or another has been explored by evolutionarily minded scholars from an astonishing range of perspectives, including archaeology, social anthropology, biological anthropology, paleoanthropology, philosophy, psychiatry, psychology, ethology, biology, history, and economics. Everywhere, the essential rationale is the same. Our docile behavior, says Wrangham, recalls that of a domesticated species. And since no other species can have domesticated us, we must have done it ourselves. We must be self-domesticated. But how could this have happened? Okay, that's the rub. I mean, that's where the discussions now are. Discussions now are no longer, are humans domesticated? The conclusion, based on all of the evidence, is that humans are domesticated. And furthermore, humans are self-domesticated. How did this happen? That is a question that Wrangham takes up. And that is a question around which there are a variety of different potential answers.
Do you, is there anything else in this chapter that you want to touch on?
Let me point out, this is the chapter where he's making the distinction between domesticated and non-domesticated species, or domesticated and wild species. So let me simply point out, he goes through the evidence, he goes through the arguments and evidence for how one would conclude that a species is domesticated, including humans. And he says, this is based on the work of a woman archaeologist called Helen Leach, and she makes the case, she argues that there are four characteristics of domesticates, that is, of domesticated species. First, domesticates mostly have smaller bodies than their wild ancestors. Okay. Second, the faces of domesticated animals tend to be shorter, projecting relatively less forward than those of their wild ancestors. Third, differences between males and females are less highly developed in domesticated than in wild animals. Always for the same reason: males become less exaggeratedly male. Finally, domesticates have a strong tendency to have smaller brains than their wild ancestors, whether mammals or birds. Okay, those are the four domains along which domesticates differ from their wild ancestors. Okay? And along these four domains, this is true for humans. Relative to, who would you compare it to? Well, one comparison group is Neanderthals, Homo sapiens neanderthalis. Arguably, a less domesticated species of humans. Neanderthals are humans. They're not modern humans. Uh, well, according to Wrangham, and I think he makes an argument that Neanderthals are less domesticated. They're more reactively aggressive. They're less socially tolerant, and they also have all of the other features that, in comparison to humans, that lead one to conclude that humans are domesticated with reference to a wild or less domesticated species. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, shall we talk about Chapter 4, Breeding Peace?
Yeah. Yep.
So this, unless I'm mistaken, this is the chapter where Wrangham reviews a remarkable series of studies, or a remarkable long-term study by a Russian geneticist, animal behaviorist, biologist called Dmitry Baliev. I think it's Dmitry. It's Baliev. Who, in short, over multiple generations, documented that by selecting for low reactive aggression, by breeding only those foxes, these were wild foxes, by breeding those wild foxes that were least reactively aggressive, were most tame with regard to humans, okay, he would select the most socially tolerant or the least reactively aggressive of the pups. He would breed those, and then each generation he would keep selecting the least reactively aggressive or most socially tolerant. And what he found was, in very few generations, he had bred, in short, a domesticated fox. He had, simply by selecting for tameness, that is, for social tolerance of humans, he had bred domestication into this species of fox. And even more interesting, or just as interesting, are the various features that co-occurred, that came along with breeding for tameness, breeding for low reactive aggression. He found that these foxes developed, the foxes over generations began exhibiting floppy ears, the piebald coloration, the white patches. These foxes began wagging their tails in response to humans. They began barking and making vocal sounds. Same as with dogs. Okay, so the same process that's argued to have occurred as wolves became domesticated into dogs. Baliev was able to document this and actually able to produce this domestication process over the period of just 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 generations. And it's an ongoing project. In fact, it continues to this day. So have I left off anything crucial, Gavin?
No, I mean that you pretty well summarized it. Yeah, just it was. I think he called the ones who were, because it took a few generations to get
It
from,
did.
wild and nasty towards the handlers to what he I think referred to as like the elites the ones who would like whine for attention or whine for food and wag their
Okay.
tails, basically the ones that
Beg.
acted,
Yeah.
yeah, like very much like dogs. And it took a, a few, but very few generations to get there. And then I think it took a few more, like considerably more generations to get to where like a large percentages of the breed or the litters were composed of those elite offspring, the ones that were extremely uh, domestic, so to speak. But also, he found that he was able to get more litters out of the more domesticated individuals, whereas the wild versions only bred once a year. Uh, you know, Belyaev was able to get 2 to 3 litters out of the more domesticated versions, even if a lot of the time the litters would fail.
Right. Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out too that while most of this chapter is focused on Baliev's work with the foxes, uh, his demonstration that selection for low reactive aggression produces what he called, I don't know if he called it the domestication syndrome, certainly Wrangham is calling it the domestication syndrome, has now been observed in a wide range of animals, okay, including, as he states on page 76, similar evidence that domesticates are less aggressive than their wild ancestors, not only towards humans, but also towards others of their own species, has been found in dogs, rats, cats, minks, and ducks. Okay, so it's a pattern of behaviors, what you would call a syndrome. It's a collection of traits and attributes and behavioral regularities that occur with repeated, that is, cross-generational selection for low reactive aggression. Okay, there's nothing magical going on here. Okay, it's all very predictable.
Another thing he talks about in this chapter, I'm just realizing that I think is important to his overall argument about human domestication, human self-domestication, is that domesticated versions of animals like dogs, and I think he talks about minks
Yeah,
and a couple others, do very well when they're reintroduced into the wild a lot of the time, which is important because he has to make the case that self-domestication can occur not only in humans but in other species, as he talks about in the next chapter. Um, but that these animals can then do well in the wild on their own without handlers or without being in captivity in order to survive and do well in their environments, and they seem to, at least most of the time.
absolutely. That's a very important point, that there's nothing peculiar about. So the domestication syndrome does not depend on humans. Domestication in non-humans, foxes, in minks and so forth, does not depend on living with humans, right? I mean, that's reasonable. You could say, well, it's only because they're living with humans. But as he notes, as Wrangham notes on page 83, towards the very end of the chapter, he says, regardless of how accurate or complex, he's making reference to the neural crest hypothesis is, and we'll set that aside for now. Baliev's experiment has sharpened our understanding of the domestication syndrome. He says what he taught us is that the domestication syndrome is produced by selection against reactive aggression, not merely by living with humans. Okay. I mean, remember he had the control groups too of foxes that he simply he bred just by randomly selecting pups to breed. They were still living around humans, living near humans, but specifically the only way, domestication itself depended on selection against reactive aggression. Okay. Crucial. It's selection against reactive aggression, not merely living with humans. Okay? The implication, says Wrangham, is remarkable. It means that a domestication syndrome should be produced any time that reactive aggression is selected against. Okay? Since aggressiveness must sometimes be selected against in the wild, there should be many cases, says Wrangham, of domestication syndromes in the wild. Again, any time reactive aggression is selected against, you should see the emergence of this domestication syndrome. And then he concludes this chapter by saying, until recently, however, no one had ever looked for such a case of domestication in wild species, which would all but certainly be produced by self-domestication.
Right.
Given that humans in the wild, living in the wild, with those.
Right,
So,
and this is the other sort of the other important point of his argument is that he has to make the case that domestication can happen in the wild, and it sounds counterintuitive, I think, because domestication is sort of feels synonymous with human involvement, but what Wrangham's arguing here, and what I think is important for the readers to keep in mind, is that when we talk about domestication and when Wrangham is talking about domestication, we really are only referring to breeding out reactive aggression or selecting against reactive aggression. And if that can happen in the wild, if natural selection, as it sometimes favors more reactive aggression, sometimes it can also, depending on the environment or certain circumstances, can also favor lower reactive aggression. And that is what Wrangham is arguing. It's what he's arguing happened to humans, and it's what he is arguing, and there's really good evidence for this, that is comorbid with all the physical features. Is selecting against reactive aggression also carries with it all of these different these differences in body size and skull shape and whatnot. So
right, leads us to so that's right. So Wrangham is now, he's taken the reader to the point where we now need to see some evidence that the domestication syndrome can be produced or is produced in the wild. That is, that it doesn't depend on selection by humans. Okay? That it is possible for wild animals, for wild species, okay, to, by virtue of selection against reactive aggression, to become domesticated, okay, to be characterized by the various features of what Wrangham is referring to as the domestication syndrome. And that leads us, and Wrangham, to a discussion of the very important distinctions between bonobos and chimpanzees. Now, bonobos, they've also been referred to as pygmy chimpanzees. They are a species of chimpanzees very closely related to another species of chimpanzees that are often referred to as common chimpanzees. You have bonobo chimpanzees and common chimpanzees, or bonobos and chimps. Okay, they are two remarkably closely related species, but they're different in very important ways. Notably, Wrangham wants to argue, and I think he makes a very persuasive argument, that bonobos are a domesticated variety of, in short, are a domesticated variety of common chimpanzees. I mean, a better way to say this is that bonobos and chimpanzees shared a recent, have a recent common ancestor that dates to somewhere between 800,000 years ago and 2 million years ago. And Wrangham is going to argue that that wild ancestor of both bonobos and chimpanzees, which lived somewhere around 1 million years ago, roughly, was the wild ancestor of two different lines, two different species, bonobos and common chimpanzees. Bonobos display a whole host of features, characteristics, psychological predispositions that are typical of domesticated species, whereas chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, display the various features and characteristics of a wild species, an undomesticated, a non-domesticated species. And therefore, Wrangham argues that common chimpanzees are likely to be closer or more similar to the ancestor of both bonobos and chimpanzees. So what he does in this chapter is he makes the case that relative to common chimpanzees, bonobos are arguably domesticated. Okay? And if they're domesticated and share these various features, well then they must have been self-domesticated because there was no domesticator. Okay, I mean, unless you want to make the case that somehow some other species domesticated them. But I don't think there's any evidence for that. The issue is how could bonobos have become self-domesticated? And Wrangham makes the argument that what differs between these, they live in very similar ecologies, very similar environments on either side of the Congo. Okay, one lives on the north side, one lives on the south side. What in the world might account for why bonobos are so much less reactively aggressive and so much more tolerant, socially tolerant with one another? Well, one difference that Wrangham points out is that chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, have shared a recent evolutionary history with gorillas. Okay, gorillas inhabit chimpanzee territory. Gorillas do not inhabit bonobo territory. Why does this matter? Because all three species eat the same basic stuff. Okay, and chimpanzees, therefore, have to do a lot more work to get the same foods, to eat the premium food that gorillas get first, because they're bigger and stronger, okay, and can muscle out chimpanzees. They get first picks. What that means is that chimpanzees have to travel farther distances. They can spend less time huddled together. Notably, female chimpanzees spend less time together. They have to disperse in the community to, basically spend the larger part of their day, eating what they can find, whereas bonobos can basically hang out and eat all the so-called gorilla food, okay, because there aren't any gorillas there. And what this means is that female gorillas have many more opportunities to build important, long-lasting bonds.
You
Okay?
mean female bonobos?
Sorry, female bonobos. I'm sorry. And so that's important because now males have a much more difficult time getting their way among, with regard to females. And so what you find is that in common chimpanzees, it's typical for males to bully females and for males to, beat up females. And females have very little recourse because they don't have these very intense, long-lasting relationships with other females, in part because they're all distributed and dispersed, trying to find high-quality food, okay, that gorillas are eating. So what this means is that you have, in short, among bonobos, according to Wrangham, females simply don't have to put up with male violence and male aggression. Okay? As a matter of fact, Wrangham argues they have selected against male aggression. Okay? Female bonobos have selected against male reactive aggression. They don't cater to male aggression and violence in the same way that common chimpanzees are forced to. Okay? So, to the extent that there's been selection against reactive aggression in bonobos, okay, attributable to the preferences and mate selections of female bonobos, well, then one might anticipate that bonobos will display the various features of a domesticated species, and that's precisely what you find. Now, this is all part of a big argument, and I mean, this is, I think it's a very defensible, reasonable argument to make that it's in the food ecology that we can understand the distinctions between bonobos and chimpanzees, notably between the less reactively aggressive bonobos and more reactively aggressive chimpanzees, and therefore between the relatively domesticated bonobos and relatively undomesticated chimpanzees. What have I left out?
I mean, you covered it pretty well. Is because I think for me, this was one of the slipperiest places
Okay.
in the book. Not because I necessarily didn't understand any of the arguments, but it just, he packs a lot into this one chapter, and you're kind of
He does.
taking a lot uh, at once in terms of the sort of successive things that had to go right or wrong in order for domestication to result in the bonobo lineage. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
it just seems like there are a lot of pieces that have to be in place. But so, I mean, one of the parts of this argument, if I'm understanding it correctly still, is that male bonobos who are aggressive towards females have to have fewer mating opportunities compared to
Correct.
chimpanzees who are have they have more copulations with females as a result of being aggressive and hitting them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that is what the evidence indicates. That is what the evidence indicates. I mean, you're right. There are a lot of pieces that Wrangham is introducing here. To date, all of the available evidence is consistent with his argument. Now, I think he's careful to make the case to be clear that this is an argument, and that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of solidifying the various pieces of this argument. But in broad brushstrokes, I think he's done a very nice job of making a defensible argument that wild animals can be domesticated. That is, if there is recurrent, repeated selection against reactive aggression, this does produce the domestication syndrome. He's using the case as of bonobos as contrasted with chimpanzees to make the case that this is precisely how we should understand the many differences between the otherwise remarkably closely related species of bonobos and chimpanzees.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, there no doubt there are pieces that are less well established than others. So, for example, I mean, again, the evidence is consistent with what we know, but I think a whole heck of a lot turns on the particular sequence of evolutionary history. So, I mean, he goes through it at one point. So, there was I think he notes that, so the ancestors of chimpanzees and gorillas all lived in the same area, and then there was and again, there's evidence for this. He's not just pulling this out of thin air. Then there was a period in which the Congo basically dried up a bit, and ancestors of bonobos and chimps were able to cross over the Congo, which otherwise is all but impassable, for several thousand years. And so you get species moving across the Congo, and then you get the Congo filling back up over time so that it becomes difficult to get back. And so while you had one period of time where you have them crossing over back and forth, you have another period of time where some are left stuck on one side. Okay, and now the river is all but impassable again. And so on one side you have less recent ancestors or descendants of the chimp bonobo species earlier on. They're stuck over here, and then on the other side you've got the same group, but now they're also stuck with gorillas. Okay, and so then you get this, and that's somewhere around 800,000 to 1.2 million years ago, whatever it is, about 1 million years ago. Then you get the evolution since that time along two different lines, bonobos and chimpanzees. Why would it happen? Because over here, these guys don't have gorillas. The gorillas never made the pass over, and that's because the mountains are over here, and gorillas need access to the foods that are available in the higher altitudes. Okay,
Oh,
so
okay. I was going to ask if he explained why gorillas also didn't make it over.
they never, they didn't because over never had the food. Or they may have made it over, but they would have died out
Okay.
over here. They need access to uh, the food stuffs that are available at higher elevations. Um, so they wouldn't be there anymore because they would have died out.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. So look, all of that needs additional fleshing out. But I think it's, again, it's a passable argument. It's a defensible argument and is broadly consistent with the paleoanthropological evidence that we do have in terms of, the receding waters, the increasing waters, the fact that gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos share ancestors at all about the right time, the distribution of, the ecological distribution of these species. So, at each step, the argument seems to live. It seems to continue to hold some weight. But again, time will tell. I think that's part of why I think this is a very interesting argument, and because it it lends itself to further investigation. He's not saying this is the truth and that's the end of it. He's saying, here's my account of how this process could have happened. But remember, for our purposes for this class, what's important is that Wrangham is making a perfectly reasonable, defensible case that wild animals indeed can and have self-domesticated. Okay? Selection against reactive aggression has produced what can otherwise be referred to as a domestication syndrome. Relative to common chimpanzees, bonobos they are far more socially tolerant. They're much less reactively aggressive. The sex differences in general are much smaller in bonobos than they are in chimpanzees. Brain size in general is smaller in bonobos than it is in chimpanzees, which doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they're smarter or not. It follows the pattern. Even the coloration, the color patterns on bonobos. Now, they don't have a white patch on their head, but they do have the white tuft of hair at their tail. They have the pink lips instead of the black lips of chimpanzees. Again, and this was part of the neural crest hypothesis that in domestication you see essentially there's a halting or a slowing up of the transmission or the movement during development of neural crest cells towards the outer portions, the extended portions of the animal. Okay, the face, the rear, the fingertips. Also, he points out that the canines, you look at the canines, they're much larger in chimpanzees than they are in bonobos in general. So in general, bonobos appear to be a domesticated type of, not of chimpanzees, but of an ancestor that both share.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yes. Yep.
All of which to say that you don't need humans to domesticate. All right. Is there anything else we want to say? We've now covered the bulk of the material from chapters 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah. No. I think, as far as I can tell, we've pretty much covered everything. I think is that I think is really crucial.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at it myself, and so again, chapter 3, he argues humans are a domesticated animal. Humans are domesticated. Okay. But nobody domesticated us, so we must have self-domesticated. Okay. Chapter 4, before he asks us to accept too much about human domestication and whether or not we display these characteristics of domestication, he wants to lay out a case of how domestication occurs. And in fact, arguably the most, sort of the richest case of tracking the occurrence of the production of the domestication syndrome is by Baliev, working with the foxes. So he shows domestication. Certainly, we understand how domestication occurs. And with regard to Baliev's foxes, what you see is that the crucial piece is selection against reactive aggression. That is what produces domestication syndrome. Well, before he gets into whether humans could have self-domesticated, he wants to make the case that this domestication process can occur in the wild and can occur without a domesticator, without a designer. Enter bonobos. A is a case of self-domestication. All right, then he will turn back in a little more focused way to the case of humans, given that that is going to be his focus for the remainder of the book. He's going to argue that humans do indeed display all the features of the domestication syndrome, and that is going to cause him to ask, how did this happen? How could humans have become domesticated? That is, how is it that humans became self-domesticated? What is the process by which reactive aggression was selected against? Okay, we need to identify that selection pressure. That's where he'll go in following chapters, notably chapter 7, called The Tyrant Problem, and then chapter 8, which he titles Capital Punishment.
Right. Yeah, so he will get there eventually.
You will indeed get there. Okay, well, very good. We will pick it back up next week and carry along Wrangham's argument.
Okay, sounds good.
Very good. Thanks, Kevin.